lecture for today. La tierra era informe, vacía y cubierta de aguas profundas y oscuras. Reinaba el caos, pero el Espíritu de Dios se movía sobre las aguas, listo para traer orden y creación al caos. Day one, día 1. Dios creó la luz y la separó de la noche, la oscuridad, llamándola día y noche. Day 2. Dios creó el cielo para separar las aguas de arriba de las aguas de abajo. Day 3. Dios juntó las aguas para formar los mares y dejó que apareciera la tierra seca, haciendo crecer las plantas. Day 4. Dios creó el sol, la luna y las estrellas para la luz y marcar el tiempo. Day 5. Dios llenó las aguas con peces y el cielo con aves. Day 6. Dios creó animales en la tierra y a los humanos a su imagen para cuidar de todo. Day 7. Dios descansó. Amén.
January, but today we're going to continue talking about the new year. And in some ways, it's going to be a part 2 of last week's sermon, but not directly related, but you'll see the connection. Last week, we talked about chaos, and we're going to revisit the chaos that we talked about last week. We're going to talk about an ancient writing known as the Enuma Elish. I know you guys love history lessons, right? So here's your history lesson. The Enuma Elish is an ancient story from Babylon. Actually, it predates Babylon. It's written almost 2,000 years before Jesus. It's about how the world was created and how the god Marduk became the most important of the gods. The story explains how Marduk defeated Tiamat. Tiamat was the goddess who represented the primordial deep waters, the chaos. And God used her body and tore it into and divided it and created the skies and the earth. This showed that Marduk brought order to the world and kept everything stable. The story became very important in Babylonian culture during the New Year celebration called the Akitu Festival. The Babylonians would read the Enuma Elish out loud. So every year, every single person living in Babylon would hear the Enuma Elish read in its entirety. They believed this would help keep the world in balance and would remind everyone that Marduk is in charge. Reading the Enuma Elish together made people feel connected, and it reminded them that their world was indeed safe and organized because of Marduk's victory. It was like a yearly promise that everything is going to be okay. To give an example of how, indeed, the Enuma Elish talks about this world and how it's safe and organized and how their supreme God created the world, I'm going to spend a little bit of time paraphrasing the story of the Enuma Elish. I'm not going to read it out loud and do some epic poem here, but I will paraphrase what this poem is saying. It's a little too boring to read in its entirety. So simply paraphrasing the story, here is the story of the Enuma Elish. The earth was formless, empty, and covered in deep waters. Chaos reigned, but God's Spirit hovered over the waters, ready to bring order in creation out of chaos. Day 1, God made light and separated it from darkness, calling it day and night. Day 2, God made the sky to separate the water above from the water below. Day 3, God gathered the waters to form the sea and let dry land appear, making plants grow. Day 4, God made the sun, moon, and the stars to give light and to mark time. Day 5, God filled the waters with fish and the sky with birds. Day 6, God made animals on land and created humans in his image to care for everything. Day 7, God rested. This is the story of the Enuma Elish. Also bears some resemblance to the story in Genesis, where the earth is formless and empty, and God's Spirit hovered above the chaotic waters, preparing to bring order out of the chaos. Similarly, the Enuma Elish, the world begins with chaos, embodied by another god named Tiamat, who represents the primordial waters, the untamedness of these waters, which means she also represented chaos in that time. In both stories, the act of creation involves bringing order out of chaos. In the Enuma Elish, the god Marduk defeats Tiamat, chaos, and uses her body and divides it to create the heavens and the earth. This symbolizes the establishment of structure and stability in the universe. Everything's going to be okay. In Genesis, God speaks and separates the waters into the heavens and into the earth, creating sky, land, and sea, bringing harmony out of chaos. And in both the Enuma Elish and in Genesis, God creates in a very orderly process, bringing stability and order out of chaos. And it's important to learn this connection between Genesis and this ancient, I know, boring history story of the Enuma Elish. But there's a connection, and it helps us gain a deeper understanding of what the story truly represented. The 7-day creation story was never, ever intended to be a history lesson on how the world was created. That's not why it was written. The story was intended to be a theological reassurance that through God, we will find order in the chaos of the world around us. In Babylon, this story was appropriately read during the New Year's celebration. And think back to last week's sermon, soon after the New Year's, when we reflected on the chaos of 2024 and how we hoped for 2025. That's what we do at the New Year's, right? Every year, throughout history, we think of the chaos we just survived and hope for a better year. But we look back in time and we learned that there had always been chaos. Humanity has always been hoping for a better year to come. And today we learned that last week's sermon, we didn't go far enough in the timeline back when we were talking about how humanity was looking at this. Because this week we're learning that through the Enuma Elish, 2,000 years before Christ, people were sitting here at the New Year's celebration, looking at the chaos of the past year, and then hoping for a better year that will bring order to our lives. Now, many people might be wondering why these two stories are almost exactly the same story. Well, it just so happens there's an answer to that question. But to understand the relationship of these two stories, we need to go back to another history lesson, the Babylonian exile. We've talked about the Babylonian exile in past sermons, and we'll continue to refer to it over many sermons through the years, because this is a pivotal moment in Jewish history, and a lot of things go back to this pivotal moment. Judaism, as we know it today, was birthed around this Babylonian exile. The Babylonian exile started around 586 BCE, but don't worry, you don't have to write the date down. I won't quiz you afterwards, but 586 is when it started. That's when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple, burnt down the temple, and took many of the Jews away from Jerusalem and brought them to Babylon, where they lived in exile for 48 years. Until 539 BCE, the Persian Empire conquered the Babylonian Empire, and the new king allowed the Jewish people to go home to their land, back to Jerusalem, and rebuild their temple. This was a hopeful time because they could return home and rebuild their temple and start over. But imagine this moment in time. These Jews were in Babylon for 48 years during a time when the average life expectancy was 40 years. This means that everyone who returned home from Jerusalem had never lived in Jerusalem. They had never experienced the fullness of Jewish culture. They'd never experienced the temple, which was Jewish culture. Sure, they had stories shared with them from their parents and grandparents, but they never truly experienced their Jewish culture firsthand. They may have Jewish blood running through their veins, but they were born and raised in Babylon. The only thing they knew was Babylonian culture, mixed with some stories from their parents and grandparents. Think of any second-generation immigrant you know today. They may be Italian, Brazilian, Cuban, pick your nationality, but they're not nearly as Italian, Brazilian, or Cuban as grandma. Often, these second-generation immigrants don't even speak their original native tongue. This is the kind of people returning back to Jerusalem. An entire generation where none of them have ever stepped foot in Jerusalem. Now, this entire mass second generation of Jews are returning to Jerusalem, and they are the ones trying to reestablish their identity of what does it mean to be Jewish. But all they know is Babylonian culture, mixed with some stories of their parents and grandparents. These second generation Jews begin the process of writing down their story. Most of the Old Testament, most of the Hebrew scripture is written around the time of the Babylonian exile. And they're writing down these stories, and as they're leaving Babylon, trying to reestablish themselves, they're asking pivotal questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? What's our origin? What are our values? And who is our God? When they begin to write down these stories, they begin, well, in the beginning. How were we created? You think about it, but all they know is Babylonian culture. Every single year of their life, they heard the Enuma Elish being recited at the Babylonian New Year's celebration. So the Jewish people simply took out the name Marduk and inserted their god, Elohim. And now the Jewish supreme God brings order out of chaos. This repackaged story from the Babylonians now explains the Jewish supremacy of their God and how he methodically created order out of chaos in this day-by-day account of bringing order to the universe. Now, the story may have been repackaged for the Jewish audience, but it's delivering the same message. And really, the Babylonians did the same thing. 2,000 years before Christ predates Babylonian culture. So every culture, as they grabbed the story, they just incorporated it into their cultural understanding and insert their God into the story. The bottom line is, whatever culture you are, whoever's reading the story, they're understanding that God, whatever name you use for that God, will bring order in the chaos of your life. But for the Jewish people, this story spoke to their specific moment in time. When they created this version of the story, they were recently released from Babylon. Even though it was wonderful news, imagine the chaos. An entire generation of second-generation Jews need to pack up and return to a homeland that they have never called home and reestablish their identity as a Jewish people. In this moment, there's an entire generation of Jews who've never, ever fully embraced Jewish culture. And these second generation Jews raised in Babylon are asking questions. What is our identity? Who are we? Who are we becoming now that we've been released? What is our purpose? What is our relationship with God? And what is our connection with the place we call our spiritual home? And now it's been, I did the math, 2,551 years since the release of the Jewish people from exile. And we sit in church. We sit in church shortly after the New Year's celebration. And by the way, when we read the seven-day creation story, when do we read this, or when do we celebrate New Year's? Let's think about it. When do we celebrate New Year's? We don't celebrate it on December 26th. We don't celebrate it on the 27th. We don't celebrate it on December 28th. We don't celebrate it on December 29th. We don't celebrate it on December 30th. We don't celebrate it on December 31st. We celebrate it 7 days after Christmas on January 1st. But technically, if you're the partiers, you're celebrating it on the 31st, right? You know. But as you celebrate it on the 31st, on the 6th day, what are you then doing on the 7th day? You're resting. You ever think about that? 7-day creation, and on the 7th day, we rest. Then after we go through that party and resting experience, we come to church, and your minister gives you a boring history lesson about some Arcadian epic tale we've never heard of before, about a Babylonian exile that we may have heard of before. And we're not wanting a boring history lesson. We want the pastor to give us a message that will resonate with us here and now. What does this ancient story have to do with us here and now? Well, let's recap. For the Babylonians, this story was a New Year's reminder about how God will bring order out of chaos. But then we fast forward for the Jewish people, and for the Jewish people, this story was a New Year's reminder about how God will bring order out of chaos. And now, for all of us here and now, asking the question, what does this have to do with us here and now? This story is a New Year's reminder about how God will bring order out of chaos. And we cannot truly appreciate and understand this without the historical background of how we got here to this moment, understanding this 7-day creation story. And now that we've heard the whole history, when we put it all together, we understand more clearly now how this 7-day creation story was never intended in any way, shape, or form to be a factual account of how the world was created. It was a story handed down from culture to culture, from generation to generation. And this story reminds us that we do indeed live in the midst of chaos. But in this chaos, we can find order. And much like the Jews who are writing the story, as they embarked on a new beginning, we enter 2025 in a world full of chaos, the California wildfires and everything else going on. We read this story as we embark on a new beginning. And we ask the same questions the Jewish people were asking 2,561 years ago. What is my identity? Who am I? And who am I becoming? What is my purpose? And what is my relationship with God? And what is my connection to the place we call our spiritual home? Over the course of thousands of years, people have been asking the same question. It's really remarkable when you think about it. Since the early Christians, go back farther, since the ancient Jews, go back farther, since the Babylonian Empire, go back farther, 2,000 years before Jesus. And humans have always been searching for the answers to the same questions we have in 2025. What is my identity? Who am I? Who am I becoming? What is my purpose? What is my relationship to God? And what is my connection to my spiritual home? In our modern age, when we try to force feed the idea that the Bible is some magical text that accurately portrays history exactly as it was written, then people who possess the ability for rational thought get turned off by religion. It just doesn't make sense. And the Bible becomes reduced to some outdated text written by a primitive culture, a text that's now irrelevant for us today. But when we stop trying to make the text some magical book, when we stop trying to make the Bible somehow compete with science like they're in competition with each other, then the Bible suddenly becomes relevant again in ways we never dreamed possible. When we read the Bible as stories written by broken humans throughout history, knowing that humans throughout history were searching for order in a world of chaos, then all of a sudden the Bible makes sense. It's no longer viewed as an outdated book, but we realize that these ancient broken humans who wrote the many different books of the Bible were simply asking the same questions we were asking. What is my identity? Who am I? Who am I becoming? What is my purpose? What is my relationship with God? And what is my connection to this place I call my spiritual home? Now, this is usually the place in a sermon where the preacher will then give you the answer to all those deep theological questions. I don't know the answer. I cannot give you the answer to any of these questions because every single one of these questions is a very personal question. Every single person in this room will answer these questions differently. Who am I? I can't say that for you. You say that for you. Only you know the answer to these questions. But this is why we have a Bible. And this is why the Bible is still relevant today. We use the Bible to explore these ancient peoples who were asking these same big questions that we have today. And this is why the concept of church is still relevant today. This is our spiritual home, the place where we come to gather as a faith community to explore these questions together. As we close, I want to leave you with this. The story of creation. Whether told through the Enuma, Elish, or Genesis, or told through the stories we write in our lives today, they all remind us of one profound truth. In the chaos of life, God is present, working to bring order, purpose, and hope. And much like the Babylonians, much like the Jews who lived in exile, we live in a world of chaos, where that chaos often feels just simply overwhelming some days. But these ancient stories invite us to see beyond the turmoil, to trust that even in the midst of uncertainty, God is creating something beautiful, and meaningful. Amen. Now I'll invite Winsong to come forward for our benediction.
Hi, I'm Reverend David Houseseal, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm also been blessed to be the convener of Winsong. It's said that you're not really dead until you're forgotten. "2024 is going to be a year we remember. Some of you have lost personal friends. And for this church, the shock of losing Alan Nagel will be something we remember for a long time. And then the year capped off with the death of former President Jimmy Carter. Remembering is important. And I'm here particularly because Winsong is a gathering of people who are devoted to becoming trusted allies to our indigenous population. And whether you are aware of it or not, there are over 4,000 Native Americans living in the greater Orlando area. And they're looking for their identity. Many of them know very little. And I'm talking about people who have registered on census as Native American. They bring a lot to us. I'm wearing this stole, which was made by someone I will never forget. Her name is Roberta Blick. And some of you remember her dearly as a kind of social conscience for us. She made this stole for me and shared with me that she was part Cherokee. So I wear it in her honor, in memory of her and her people. But I also want you to know that among these cultures that are often invisible to us, they have all the kinds of struggles that Pastor Brad just shared. And they are doing something about it. December is a month to remember for Native people, because that was the month the 38 Dakota Native Americans were hanged the day after Christmas. It was also the month the Sitting Bull was assassinated. It was also on the 29th of December that the massacre at Wounded Knee took place, with over 200 to close to 300 Native American children, mothers and fathers were killed and left to die in the snow. But they're doing something about it. They had a ride that was in December, a ride of reconciliation that but honored all those who died. And even now, as we're here, there's a huge amount of them who are doing a 400-mile run because of the Fort Denison outbreak, spiritual run that's taking place right now for a period of weeks to try and run 400 miles to remember what happened as the Native American fled the Fort Denison. So I'm going to share with you a prayer It's a part of a longer prayer that's one of their prayers of Christmas. Hear this through native eyes and ears. Great Spirit, Father, Son, Mother Moon, today you gave the breath of life to a child, a sacred life to walk among us with his head held high with dignity. This child stands before us, showing honor and respect. His way is one of strength in wisdom and understanding that comes from his heart, his soul. With his eyes, he sees all that is good, and with his ears, he hears all that is good, and his words are strong and powerful. Thank you for this child, and for each breath you give, that our remembering will be in his sacred paths, bringing hope, life, joy, peace, and love. And I say to you, Wankantaka, Kiki Un, may the Great Spirit give you balance and peace as you go.